But
And so the tariff of 1828, the problem of it was it created imports or duties, taxes as high as 45% on imported goods. Anytime that any tax is placed on any product coming into the United States, you will always see a respective retaliatory tariff placed by the other country for American goods going into their countries. Does that make sense? So a lot of times presidencies and presidents believe that, hey, if we put a protective tariff on American, or so that American products are purchased more, well, the effect of it is simply that the American surplus products can't go anywhere because there's some other protective tariff put in place by like England or Germany or France or China or wherever else. And so it actually is counterproductive. Now the unfortunate, go ahead.
Are tariffs still like ever used?
Yeah, tariffs are used all the time. In fact, most products that are produced in outside countries, outside of the United States, are taxed as an import. They do have a tariff on them. That is part of the reason why there was the argument for the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, right? Because it would reduce the tariffs for products coming in from China and Southeast Asia. The problem with it is, in that particular case, is that China and Southeast Asia can already produce products so much cheaper than the United States can, that even with the protective tariff, they can produce it still cheaper than the U.S. can. Does that make sense? And so if you get rid of the tariff, it makes it even more impossible for Americans to compete. Okay? Now there are some other tariff or free trade things that have been negotiated, such as like NAFTA. And there are arguments that says NAFTA has worked really well, and there are arguments that say NAFTA does not work very well. Does that make sense? But generally speaking, the individuals, it's intended to protect American industry more than anything else, but it has a tendency to hurt American farmers more than anything else. Okay? Because especially in early industry in the United States, we were really only producing enough for being consumed in the United States. A little bit extra, but not a lot extra. Whereas American farmers have always produced way more product than we can ever consume in the United States. So that product has to go somewhere. And the more mechanized we've become, the more extra product we've been able to produce. So for example, if we were to get rid of NAFTA today, it would dramatically hurt American corn production because so much of our corn that we produce in the United States is not used in the U.S. In fact, I think it's like we don't even use half of the corn that we actually produce in the United States. The rest of it goes to places like China, but the biggest consumer of American corn is actually Mexico. So if we were to get rid of NAFTA, it would really hurt American farmers. Does that make sense? So it might protect American industry, but it is also going to hurt American farmers. Now, because the tariffs were so high, at this particular point in time, New England, who had largely pushed through the tariff of 1828, it helps them, right? Most of New England is manufacturing based. It also really, really hurts the South, as most tariffs do. I said protective tariffs hurt farmers, right? Well, the majority of our farmers at this point are in the South and producing cotton. And so, as New England pushes it through, individuals in the southern states, Webster and Calhoun, argued that it was directly intended to target the Southerners, and it was being used as a roundabout way to eliminate slavery. And so they call it the Tariff of Abominations, basically arguing that this tariff was so expansive and so large that it must be gotten rid of. Otherwise, if it wasn't, that the South Carolina argued that we should be able to leave the Union itself. In fact, it is so frustrating, and the idea of the tariff itself is so frustrating, that John C. Calhoun, who is, what role does he fill? Yeah, he actually resigns from his position because of the tariff being passed. Does that make sense? Okay. So he actually steps down from that position and resigns over the tariff of abominations, the document that actually calls it a tariff of abominations, because he had a part in writing it. But the tariff itself, then, they look at it, how do we deal with this? And what is the United States going to do about the tariff itself? The argument becomes that we need to actually reduce the tariff, and ultimately the tariff is reduced through the passage of the Tariff of 1832. The Tariff of 1832 is actually a compromise tariff, and it argues that we are going to reduce the tariff down by 10% over a few years, right? It's not going to be immediate, but it will reduce the tariff down over time. And it's largely Henry Clay that helps to negotiate this new tariff. Remember, Henry Clay becomes known as the Great Compromiser, not only for his role in the Missouri Compromise, but also his role in the 3/5 Compromise, and even his role then in the compromise leading to the Tariff of 1832. But this doesn't solve the key issue. The key issue that comes up once again over the Tariff of Abominations is whether or not we are actually a union. Does that make sense? And also, what power does the federal government truly have over the states? If the states find a law that is or something that is put forth by the federal government, if they see this as being something that is unconstitutional, can those states declare those things null and void? This is, remember, a rehashment of the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions, which dealt specifically and called for the repeal of what acts? The Alien and Sedition Acts, right? This idea that maybe sometimes the federal government oversteps their role or the bounds that are created by the Constitution, and if they do, it should be the responsibility of the states to put those federal powers into check. Now, this comes to a head at what's called the Webster-Hayne debate, and it is a 9-day showdown between Hayne from South Carolina, who argues states' rights and argues that the tariffs themselves are a violation of the Constitution because there's nothing really in the Constitution that allows for some of this dividing tariff between the North and the South. And he also argues along the lines with Calhoun towards nullification. The other one is Webster. Yes, Webster is, as in Webster Dictionary, same person. He is of New England, and he says the people, not the states, allow for our government to exist. Whereas Hayne argued that it's the states are working towards that. And he also argues over liberty and over union, and he argues that they are inseparable, that the union itself is inseparable. Whereas Hayne argues that when we came together under both the Articles of Confederation and again under the Constitution, when we signed that document approving it, we joined a compact with each other. We were all these different separate states, and we agreed to come together as one. We didn't have to agree to come together as one, but we chose to agree to come together. Okay? And because as states we chose to unionize and to become a union together, we can also make the choice to secede, to leave said union. We can leave at any point in time that we want. Whereas Webster says you cannot separate the union. If you separate the union, the United States ceases to exist. We are the United States, not the states that are united. Does that make sense? Okay. And so it's a different entity within there. Both feel that they can win this argument, but what it really does is it just makes the division between North and South even wider. There is no common ground that is found here. It's just, here's my argument, I'm right, you're wrong. Here's my argument, I'm right, you're wrong. And there's no meeting of the minds in the end of it. It's just, here's where we're at. Does that make sense? And at the end of the 9 days, the conversation stops, not because there's any sort of solution to the conversation, but simply because of the fact that we say, okay, we're done with this conversation and we're moving on. And what ultimately winds up getting put in place as part of this, because we're bringing up issues over slavery and states' rights and everything else, is we see imposed a gag rule where you could not talk about issues of slavery or anything else like that within the walls of Congress. Kind of odd if you think about it, right? That we're not going to talk about issues, right? This is kind of what they're supposed to be doing. But ultimately, it is these same ideas that lead to the Civil War. Also under Jackson's presidency, which I personally just find really interesting. It really doesn't have any larger context or anything else like that, but Jackson is struggling with members of his cabinet, and in particular, he has one member of his cabinet, a guy by the name of Henry Eaton, and his wife Peggy. Peggy, actually, she's like that kid in school that really wants to be friends with everybody, but she's a little awkward and a little weird, and everybody's kind of like, I kind of find you annoying. I want to try to be nice to you, but I really just can't stand you. Does that make sense? I mean, think about it. Like, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? That's Peggy, but she really wants to be friends with everybody. And so she tries hosting like dinner parties for the other wives of the secretaries, and they don't show up. And she also, they will host parties and stuff, and they don't invite her. So it's like literally a high school drama going on right now, okay?
Why is, okay, other than she's annoying, is she just like bad at politics? Or
No, it's not that she's bad at politics. She's just awkward. She's just...
That's dumb.
I know, but this is reality of life, and I'm sorry to break it to you people, but it doesn't go away as you get older. It just is the same. Does that make, I'm sorry, but it is what it is. So poor Peggy, she largely is being ignored by the other women in the wives, and Jackson is actually pretty fearful that Peggy Eaton is gonna wind up being extremely hurt, much like his poor wife was. And he actually is fearful that she might have a heart attack too, like his wife did, because of everything that everybody was saying bad about her. And so Jackson calls every member of his cabinet together in a meeting and sits them down and literally tells his cabinet members to get their wives to behave and play nice with Miss Peggy Eaton. Now you have to consider the time, right? If your husband told you to do something as a woman, you did it. Does that make sense? So he's actually really trying to create a lot of sway over, and he's trying in a way to deal with some of the tension that exists between his cabinet members and to solve some of it, but he only creates more because his cabinet members are like, what? Literally, this is what our conversation is about Peggy Eaton and the fact that our wives don't want to play with her? This is why you're calling us to this big old meeting? And so it actually causes more tension within the White House and also causes a power struggle between Calhoun and Van Buren. This power struggle will ultimately lead to Van Buren being chosen as vice president, because Van Buren winds up actually giving extra, like, ensures that Peggy Eaton gets a little bit extra attention from his wife. So, but as a result of it, he winds up becoming VP. And Jackson increasingly becomes much more reliant on his kitchen cabinet rather than the secretaries of state. Calhoun is extremely critical of Jackson at this point. He's already been pretty critical of a lot of different things, but this in conjunction with the Tariff of Abominations, with the Peggy Eaton affair, with Jackson's use of the veto, Calhoun is like, I'm done, I'm out of here, and leaves, okay? So he resigns as VP because of that. So not secretary, sorry, VP was where it was, okay? Calhoun then, as a senator from the South, begins defending defending even more slavery and states' rights. And Calhoun continues to threaten secession if the tariff is not lowered. Within all of these things, we talked about compact theory here a little bit. I was a little bit ahead of myself. But within all of these things, Calhoun becomes one of the great agitators towards secession for South Carolina. And ultimately, it's part of the reason why South Carolina will be the first state to leave the Union when Lincoln is elected. Right? We talked about this. Sorry. Okay. Next piece. This is a lovely political cartoon here. Okay? If you notice, okay? Jackson is the guy with the big white hair. Okay, this is Jackson. And this is Biddle, who was in charge of the Bank of the United States. He was the bank president. But Jackson believed that the Bank of the United States was too powerful and believed that it should instead just be privately, or because it was privately owned, they were creating a monopoly, and also they were creating, or the system in the bank was unconstitutional. So if you look at like all of these different people in this particular cartoon, obviously we have Jackson and Nicholas Biddle as the boxers in the middle. The lady holding the bottle of port here, the heavier set lady, the bottle of port says, or she says above her head, says, "Darken as daylights, Nick. Put some screws to him, my tulip." Daniel Webster, who is standing right by the lady here. Do you see him? So this is Webster right here. Right? Daniel Webster, above him it says, "Blow me top if Nick ain't been crammed too much. As you see, he is losing his wind." Henry Clay, then, who is standing right next to Daniel Webster. So this is, will not let me, dang it. It won't let me zoom and draw at the same time. That's annoying. But this is him, then, okay, right next to Biddle. It says, oh, no, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, it is. Okay, it says, "Hurrah, Nick, my kitty. Hit him in the pelt in the smelters." Then we have the tiny little guy standing behind Jackson, and that is Martin Van Buren. It says, "Go get it, Hickory, my old duffer. Give him in the bread basket. It'll make him throw up his deposits." Behind him stands Major Jack Downing, which is kind of like the mythological Jackson. It's not like an actual person. It's just like the representation of Jackson. Does that make sense? It's weird, but it says in there, it says, "I swan if the general hadn't been taking lessons from the fooler." And then the man standing here next to the whiskey bottle with the cat on his head says, "Hurrah, my old yellow flower of the forest. Walk him in like a streak of greased lightning through a gooseberry bush." So all of those things are kind of put into place there. But Jackson, ultimately, between him and Biddle, he argued that the bank itself was unconstitutional and should be removed. He argued instead all land should be paid via gold and silver and not through the use of paper money. And largely, he believed that the Bank of the United States only supported the Northeasterners and actually also helped out the British. Whereas Biddle, as bank president, was largely supported by both Clay and Webster. And they decide in 1832 to apply early for a recharter of the Bank of the United States because they worried that if it wasn't taken care of in advance, then they wouldn't be able to get the recharter back through Congress. And so, although they're able to get the recharter of the Bank of the United States early and put it through, ultimately Jackson, who believed the Bank of the United States was unconstitutional, will veto the second charter of the Bank of the United States. He argues in his bank message veto, he says, prostitution of the government for the advancement of the few at the expense of the many. Biddle argues that Jackson's bank veto was a manifesto of anarchy, and argued that Jackson's use of the veto was going too far. If we look at this particular political cartoon, it's a little difficult to see, but all of the little, stupid thing, all of the little, like, rats, their faces are like Biddle and Clay and Webster. So, and the cat itself is Jackson, going out killing all the little rats. So political cartoons definitely playing a hero role in anti-Jackson propaganda, including this piece of propaganda, which you would have seen on the front of your book of knowledge and had some questions about that as well. And in this picture, we show Jackson holding the veto in there. He also is standing on a torn up U.S. Constitution, and he also this is the coat of arms of the state of Virginia as well. And so we see him standing on that as well, kind of this, again, anti-Biddle message in here, and that Johnson was actually destroying the United States. The bank war inspires tons and tons of different cartoons. That's a little bit better version of it. You can, I hate that, get rid of that stupid pen. So you can see that a little bit better in there, all the different pieces and parts of it. But Jackson will actually use the power of the veto more than any other president, and in that way he extends the power of the presidency. He argues that he is maintaining democracy, but the anti-Jacksonians argue that he's actually going against democracy because the people elected members to the House of Representatives and the state appointed senators, so therefore these people actually have a greater voice, or they're a greater reflection of the American public's belief system and ideas than the President of the United States. So he should not use the power of the veto. But post-Jackson, pretty much all presidents post-Jackson have used the power of the veto as a way not just to look at things from, okay, is this unconstitutional or not, versus I don't like this piece of legislation, so I'm going to veto it because I don't like it. Does that make sense? And that's a key distinction and a key change post-Jackson. But ultimately, he's able to destroy the Bank of the United States, and he takes the money for the Bank of the United States and he divides it up amongst the state banks now that he deemed sound. These banks were often referred to as Jackson's pet banks, or his banks that he preferred. So, what's that? Where his friends worked at, where, you know, he had cronies, whatever. So it may not have actually been the best banks for him to, like, take this federal money and put it into. The other huge problem with the destruction of the Bank of the United States is the fact that once the Bank of the U.S. is gone, there's no federal regulation of the monetary system, either printing of money or anything else. So these pet state banks, they were actually allowed to print money. So what they did is they printed a ton of paper money. Well, the problem is anytime you print more money without having anything to back it up, it simply causes inflation, which ultimately is what leads, in part, between that and the Tariff of Abominations, is what leads to the financial panic that will happen under Martin Van Buren's presidency, which he will get blamed for. But it really isn't Martin Van Buren's fault. It is Jackson's fault. Okay? And this holds true throughout American history. It is never the president who is sitting in office when those policies take effect. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, most of Jackson's policies, the destruction of the Bank of the United States, the eliminating of paying in things, especially land, and buying federal property, which FYI, the vast majority of land is owned by the federal government at this point in time in U.S. history. Does that make sense? Because of the Louisiana Purchase, who owns that land? America. The federal government owns that land. Does that make sense? We don't start to see the privatization of land until we're going to see the railroads being built across the United States. Then the railroads begin to own this land, and also with the Homestead Act passing in 1860, we see private individuals owning land. But who do they get that land from? The federal government. Does that make sense? It's only in much more modern days when we're looking at selling of property from selling from like me to you. Does that make sense? Otherwise, it is federally owned. So this idea of you have to pay for land in gold and silver makes it very difficult for people to purchase land. Okay. And begins to move us away from that idea of a yeomanry citizenry as well. It also will largely affect the election in 1832 because most Americans actually agreed with Jackson that the Bank of the United States was a failure and needed to be removed. And so Jackson will have a sweeping landslide victory in the election of 1832. He is re-elected with more than 3/4 of the electoral votes. So pretty impressive. Jackson ultimately then as well in 1836 will go on to basically handpick his successor, Martin Van Buren. And because of the success of Jackson's presidencies with the common man, Martin Van Buren is easily elected as our new president of the United States, running against Henry Clay.
What's the anti-Masonic party like?
Freemasonry
already here now?
Yeah, well, Freemasonry has been here like since the very beginning. George Washington was a Mason.
What did they do?
So
Build buildings of bricks?
yes, that's what the Masons did. They were a union of builders.
But why are they so secretive? Like, what do they do now?
Well,
That's why there was anti-Masons.
yeah,
We don't like this.
What do you know? Like, what did they?
My grandpa's a Mason.
yeah.
I don't think you should say that.
You can say that you're a Mason. You just can't share anything that happens inside of
What
Mason.
happens
Mason.
inside?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not a Mason. I don't know. Okay. So what kind of happens is what we're going to start to see in the election of 1832 and even forward is the issue of slavery is getting more and more complicated in the United States. Does that make sense? And political parties are becoming more divided. Although we still predominantly have two political parties, we're going to see the eruption of some of these minor independent third parties. Does that make sense? Just like we have today. We have the Green Party, we have the Libertarians as kind of the two primary third parties, but there's also the Tea Party, there's all sorts of other third parties. Does that make sense? So third parties have always existed in a small format or another. The independent Democrats, these were like the anti-Jackson Democrats. Does that make sense? So the Democrats under Jackson, these used to be the Democratic Republicans. Does that make sense? And then the Republican Party splits for the creation of the Democratic Republicans and the National Republicans. And then we have the anti-Masonics. These individuals argued that the individuals on the East Coast had way too much control over politics and power. Okay? So they were generally speaking, they were outside of that circle of trade. Okay?
So they didn't make stuff with bricks.
What's that?
They didn't do brick building.
The anti-Masonics, no, are not making things with bricks. But what you have to understand is the Masonic, to be a Mason, initially it was like a union. Does that make sense? It was a trade union in its initial, way back in Europe in its initial formation.
Wow.
Over time it no longer becomes a union of just Masons, of people who built things, stone masons. Does that make sense? It becomes a union or a group of guys from all sorts of different,
Cults.
no, different, industry and other jobs. Does that make sense? But generally people who were wealthier individuals in society. had some sort of a trade or skill
Action.
or connection. Or I think, and I don't know on this, but I think you can also, like, if your dad is a Mason, I think you have like a route in to become a Mason. I don't know. Do you know, was your grandpa a Mason?
My grandpa's a Mason. I don't know if my great grandpa is.
Okay, yeah.
It's like Fight Club, like Versatile Fight Club.
I mean, I could ask him.
Yeah.
He's in town today.
Okay. Yeah, maybe ask him. Share with us.
Wow.
All right, so when we look at Jackson's legacy, we're going to use the acronym. Oh, come on, go away. My computer's being really slow. We can use the acronym New Nix. Okay, so it's a new democracy. Can't see that. Don't trip on that. I just can't throw it all the way to the garbage can right now. Okay, so we have in this new democracy, right? He's going to extend democracy and extend white male suffrage by eliminating property qualifications. Okay, the K stands for the killing of the bus. What's the bus? Bank of the U.S. Okay. The N is the nullification. Crisis. I is Indian removal. C is, oh shoot, C, oh, I know, creation of the two-party system. Under what we'd seen happen previous to Jackson is we had the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Well, the Anti-Federalists go away. We see the emergence of the Democratic Republicans, and then it's just the Democratic Republicans until we get to Jackson, and then we see the Democratic Republicans and the National Republicans. Does that make sense? Which then turn into the Republicans and the Democrats. Yes, no, somewhat so? Okay, all right. The second K is his kitchen cabinet. And the S is his spoils, which the spoils system will remain in place until the assassination of Andrew Garfield and the passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Act. Okay? And to a certain extent, I would argue that the spoils system is back. Okay?
Oh, absolutely.
So,
It's not like that Betsy DeVos, like, you know, paid $10 million for this campaign.
yeah, I know. Like, it's, I don't get how she does that because it should be, or whatever. Anyways, all right, so, but Jackson, accomplishments, right? He enlarges the power of the presidency. He converts the veto into an effective presidential power. We see parties seen as a positive good, but we also see growing social stratification. His policies lead to the financial panic of 1837, which lasts until 1843. Post-Jackson, we will see this division, and we will see the kind of division between the Whig and the Democratic campaign. We also, though, see that voter turnout will also increase to where more and more Americans are actually not only able to vote, but also turning out to vote. Voter turnout is about 80% in America at this time, which is insane. As far as, I mean, I get that it's only white males that are voting, but think about it in this context. You have 80% of the eligible voters who are voting. Today, when you have mass transit, you have cars, you have internet, early voting, mail-in voting, like a bazillion options for you to be able to vote on time, early, whatever, and a ton of different polling stations instead of like, here's your polling station in the biggest city, and you travel to that city days, weeks, etc. We have like a voter turnout of right around 50%.
I mean, depends on the state.
nationally, we have a voter turnout of about 50% at a presidential election.
You know, it's accessible.
Well, yeah, but I mean, voting is pretty stinking accessible today in comparison to, you know, 1830s. I mean, like, we can do better, peeps, is kind of what I'm saying, right? Okay. We also then will see other individuals who will rise through some of Jackson's policies to gain additional status and ultimately lead some of these individuals to become presidents later on, including like William Henry Harrison, although he dies. So that works out really, really well. And we do see kind of that creation of, like I said, of the two-party system. Although at this point in time, it'll be the Democrats and the National Republicans will drop the National Republicans and become the Whigs for a short amount of time, and then will ultimately go back to being Republicans. But they're not the Republicans that you think of today. The Republicans of the 1860s are the liberal. They are the Liberal Party. It is not until, kind of, but pretty much not until FDR that we will see the Democratic Party become the Liberal Party. Does that make sense?
So the Democrats were the racist.
The Democrats were the conservatives.
And slave owners.
And slave owners. And frontiersmen. So they were the people on the outskirts. And the Republicans had a tendency to be the New Englanders and the individuals in power and etc. Educated.
Still are.
Democrats are pretty well educated too. So, but it's like
Not for debate.
the older you get, the tendency you have to vote more Republican. But the younger you are, the tendency you have to vote more Democratic. Okay?
That sounds good.
What's that?
Because yesterday's liberals are today's.
Yeah.
After you work a while, and you realize that
Well,
I'm into this stuff.
Part of it also is that a lot of the things that Democrats call for help younger people. Does that make sense? Versus helping people as you are more established or as you're older. So, and as you get older, you might have a higher income, which then would lead you to lean more Republican because then you like the tax breaks that they have a tendency to give the wealthier side of America. Does that make sense? So, like, that's why people switch.
People can switch, it's not against the law.
Yeah, you can switch as many times as you want, or you can vote independent and switch all the time. That works too. But you don't get a vote in a primary if you're an independent.
What people don't think.
Okay, all right, so that's the content of Jackson, okay? We have some time. When are we done in this class?
10 minutes.
10 minutes?